there were things that were happening at the DNC that made me think we had entered into some kind of upside down universe. And one of those was talking about the Democratic Party protecting our freedoms. And it was the most bizarre thing to hear from a party who genuinely finds a lot of the rights, illuminated in the Constitution distasteful and troublesome. So I wasn't the only one to notice this. Economist Alexander Salter is a professor of economics at Texas Tech University and a signatory of the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. He also is the author of a fantastic column that ran on Real Clear Politics shortly after the DNC. Conservatives, not progressives, are freedom's champion, and he joins me today. Alexander, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Mandy. Thank you.
That was a really long wind-up, but I figured I needed to set it up because your column does a really great job of clearly delineating which party is the true party of freedom. Now, did you see the same thing I saw at the DNC, and is that what inspired you?
I saw something strange, something that even now, more than a week after the fact, I'm having a hard time explaining. A party which for a century, a political movement, a political philosophy for more than a century, has committed itself to taxing us, regulating us, mandating, nudging, surveilling, is now all of a sudden the party of freedom. Well, at least as we understand freedom in terms of the American experiment, it means ordered liberty. It means natural rights. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Progressivism as a philosophy is all about curtailing those rights in the pursuit of other social goals. Now, perhaps those are legitimate goals, and we can have that debate. I, for one, side with the founders. But nonetheless, to identify as a pro-freedom movement is a radical departure from what progressivism has admitted to the world it has been for, again, more than a century. This is very strange.
Well, don't you think, though? Ultimately, we see the end results of progressivism taken to the nth degree in countries like Venezuela, right? You see what happens when government takes over everything to create a utopia. And that branding is becoming an issue, I think, for the progressive movement. It has been for a long time, as people are seeing in real time what happens when someone says, I'm going to take care of you cradle to grave. So is this just kind of a sort of a marketing attempt to rebrand what they're doing as freedom in an attempt to change the language in such a way that we won't even notice that it's not?
You have to figure it's mostly rhetorical, because look at what they purport to offer under the label of freedom. A candidate for president of the United States has just called for price controls on essential food items. Well, if you want the freedom to purchase a good at a low price, except that there's no goods on the shelf to buy, am I any freer? Great, you've capped the price of food, except now I go to the grocery store and there's nothing on the shelf. That doesn't make me feel very free. Income taxes, unrealized capital gains taxes, subsidies to new home buyers. That one sounds like a good one until you realize all it's going to do is drive up the cost of housing even further. From 2016 to 2020, average home prices in the United States rose about 11%. Since President Biden has taken office, they're up approximately 25%. And when you offer a $25,000 subsidy to new home buyers, as Vice President Harris wants to do if she becomes president, that's going to result in not many more houses, because it takes a lot of time and effort to get new housing builds in, but it's going to immediately jack up prices and to make housing even more unaffordable for many Americans. What kind of freedom is this that makes all goods and services more expensive and harder to get? Again, this is not what most Americans think of when they think of liberty.
I read a column not too long ago about, it was written by a guy on the left who said he flies a flag outside his house, and his neighbors for the longest time assumed he was a Republican. And his point was, we've allowed certain symbols to be sort of hijacked by one side or the other, and it's time for us to take those symbols back. And after reading your column, I'm like, do they just view the word freedom as a symbol and they want to attach it to what they're doing, again, hoping we won't notice? Because everything you just laid out obviously is not about freedom. And more importantly, are Republicans able to push back in a way that's going to sort of stop this, nip it in the bud?
I think that conservatism has within itself resources to effectively convince the American public, no, if what you're after is freedom, if what you desire is liberty, the natural rights proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence and secured by our Constitution, here's where you want to look. There's currently a big debate going on in conservative circles over the exact nature of the proper conservative policy stances on various issues. So you have people who identify as national conservatives who want to make sure that the government is affirmatively upholding our rights. You have freedom conservatives, people who want to restrain the growth of government. But even if you look at the nationalist conservative side, you think, oh, that kind of sounds like progressivism. If you read their policy proposals, a lot of them could have been written by Alexander Hamilton. This is very much a debate within the accepted parameters of what we want the government to do for us to accept and uphold natural rights. But when you read about what progressives want to do, again, it sounds like vintage Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States more than 100 years ago, who famously said, look, the American experiment is obsolete. Separation of powers, checks and balances, all of that was a bad idea. All we've done is divide power without making it responsible. So in place of our historical traditions of ordered liberty, I want to unleash the administrative state. I want to build a powerful bureaucracy led by the president. It's going to be largely unconstrained by the judiciary, uncontrolled by Congress, and we're just going to turn everything into one giant bureaucracy and make things work better that way. Well, for anyone who spent any length of time at a Department of Motor Vehicles, I think that you know the limit of that. Imagine wanting to turn all of social life into the post office and thinking that most Americans are going to say, yep, that's freedom. It is absolutely not.
So, you know, the what you were just talking about is the concept that there's a better way to do it, so we should ditch everything and start over from scratch. That is very much a part of the progressive movement right now. Whether it is Black Lives Matter and their stated goal of destroying the nuclear family and ripping out the capitalist system, it seems that progressivism at this point is more about destruction of what has come before, whether or not it works or not, and more about just sort of burning everything down in these nebulous hopes that whatever will rise up seems better. Is that an accurate assessment in your view?
I'm sure that progressives don't think that they're doing that, but I would say that that is the practical consequences of their policies. And this is one of the major reasons that I identify as a conservative and specifically a member of the Freedom Conservative movement. If you go and look what they're actually trying to achieve, freedom and conservatives, they want to strengthen the nuclear family because they recognize that it is an absolutely necessary social institution for promoting collective harmony. They want to make sure that we return power from Washington, D.C. to state and local governments because we know that the closer that citizens are to places where the governing actually happens, the higher quality governance you actually get, the less corruption there is. There's all these things that freedom conservatives want to do in terms of, for example, restraining the growth of government spending, getting a control over the Federal Reserve and monetary policy so we don't have another several years episode of crippling inflation like we just suffered through. On every one of these issues, I see progressives on the side of making government even bigger than it already is and less accountable than it already is. And so those two things together are a surefire recipe for poor public policy. I would argue that if we want to actually get the American experiment back on track, we need to embrace the principles outlined in the Freedom Conservative Statement of Principles and put those into practice. And that's how we actually get back things like federalism, subsidiarity, checks and balances, the things that made America a truly great nation and can again.
I thought last night, and I don't want to bring you into a conversation about last night's debate because I didn't bring that up with you, but one of the things that struck me last night was that President Trump missed an opportunity to really remind people of what you just said, that ultimately we live in a federalist system, and with issues like abortion, those are best decided at the state level. And we have allowed so much creep over the years, the last 100 years of federalism or federal power, I should say, that people forget. Most of the things that we expect out of the federal government should be done by the state government. Is that just a function of a poor educational system when it comes to how things are supposed to work, that we've now just accepted that this is how they do work?
Goodness, that's a story in and of itself. Part of this is due to politicians and bureaucrats doing what politicians and bureaucrats always try and do, which is get more power for themselves. But this is also, I think, a fault with us. the citizens, because this happened over a long enough time span that we really should have woken up before now and said, this is not where most decisions are supposed to be made. Again, as you said, the system is designed such that most of the governing we actually care about on a day-to-day basis should take place at the state and local levels. Unfortunately, the American public is legendarily indifferent to these sort of procedural arguments. They care much more about what is done rather than who decides or what procedures we follow in order to do it. If we're going to actually pull this thing back from the brink, if we're going to get control of the deficit and the national debt, if we're going to rebuild an economy that works for all Americans, then we have to actually start caring about these procedural arguments. Think about healthcare, for example. We have this whole debate about what Washington, D.C. should do about healthcare, and that's an important debate. But we need to add an entire other dimension to it. The health outcomes and public health issues affecting Washington, D.C. are not the same as Austin, Texas, as Los Angeles, as East Liverpool, Ohio. Pick your city, pick your locality, pick your municipality. It's going to be different circumstances reflecting the particulars of time and place. And so we need to decentralize these major policy decisions as much as we can so we can have more direct oversight of them, so we can better control financing and production and distribution, and so that we can better reflect the natural variation in this massive country of more than 330 million people. We cannot continue to do this from the top down because one-size-all solutions, are not actually going to work when you have a country as diverse as we are.
And that was the genius of our system in the first place. I mean, it was the portability of being able to go to a different state if they were more to your liking than being stuck in one place where we're all under the same federal edicts. And, this is such an interesting conversation. What about, let me ask you this question. This is completely out of the blue, just in case you wonder where this came from. I have long been advocating, not long, but long enough, for the complete decentralization of the departments of government. I don't think there's any reason why the Department of Commerce should necessarily be in Washington, D.C. And with technology being what it is now, there's no reason to have all of these people that all work for the government and all have a vested interest in lobbying for bigger government to be in the same town when the rest of us are out here in flyover country, right? I mean, is there any chance, or what would you think the possibility of that, just decentralizing these agencies, putting them close to the people they actually serve? Would that ever happen?
Yeah, geographic dispersion of the agencies, of the entire departments, even if the circumstances call for it. That's been a proposal that's been on the table for a while. It comes back every now and then. At the margin, I think it would help. It might make sense to have major offices for Interior, for example, in Wyoming and Montana and places like that are actually close to where a lot of that governing takes place. That being said, I don't think that our problem is primarily one of concentration of these offices in one city. I think that a lot of what we're seeing is due to the fact that a lot of people just don't care about decentralized local government. Decentralized local government is hard. It requires active participation of the citizenry. It's very fun to lambast the politicians and bureaucrats and judges because we think that this is something that has been done to us, the erosion of our constitutional heritage. And partly that's true. But we, the citizens, we, the people, have to also admit our complicity, that we allowed this to happen, oftentimes by allowing other people to dictate us the ordinary outcomes of you can choose option A or B, but federalism isn't really on the table. Well, when we acquiesced to that, we kind of asked for this.
Yep.
And so I think that having that agency dispersal would help in the sense that it would actually make it easier for John Q. Public to keep an eye on what the government is doing. But that doesn't change the fact that we have to actually take an interest. We have to get involved. We have to be ready to devote our time and attention to public affairs at a meaningful level, even if there's no concrete payout for us. And that's a tall order, but that is absolutely what order, liberty, and self-governance require.
I hate it when my own personal freedoms depend on the actions of others to be more civically engaged. That seems like a mighty big bar for those to get over right now. Alexander Salter, I really appreciate the conversation. I find it very, very interesting. Your column grabbed me right away, and I enjoyed it. I linked to it today on my blog at mandysblog.com for the listeners. I hope we can chat again in the future.
Thank you so much, Mandy.